The first thing I saw wasn't the excavator, it was the rose bushes. They'd been there for almost 20 years, blooming every spring like they had something to prove, and now they were nothing but torn roots and muddy stems scattered across my backyard. Then I looked up and realized the machine wasn't even on my property by accident. Somebody had deliberately driven it nearly 15 feet past my fence line, and standing there with a coffee in one hand and sunglasses perched on top of her head was my neighbor, Vanessa Caldwell, smiling like she was hosting a garden party instead of tearing apart a piece of my life. If you've ever owned a home for a long time, you know a backyard isn't just dirt and grass. It's birthdays, quiet mornings, family cookouts, the place where your dog buried half his toys, and where people you loved laughed before life carried them somewhere else. My wife, Ellen, planted those roses one Mother's Day after telling me she wanted something we'd both still be able to look at when we got old. She passed away 7 years later after a long fight with cancer, but every spring those flowers came back, and somehow that made the house feel a little less empty. So when I watched an excavator crush them into the ground before breakfast, I wasn't thinking about money. I was thinking about memories. I walked straight across the yard without saying a word until one of the workers noticed me. He shut the machine down, looked at Vanessa, then looked back at me with that uncomfortable expression contractors get when they realize they're standing in the middle of someone else's problem. "Can I help you?" he asked carefully. I pointed at the torn earth. "You can start by explaining why your machine is sitting in my backyard." Before he could answer, Vanessa casually stepped forward, sipping her coffee like we were discussing the weather. "Morning, Daniel," she said. "I figured you'd notice eventually." Eventually. That word still makes me laugh. "Notice what?" I asked. "That you're stealing half my yard?" She gave a little shrug that somehow managed to be both polite and insulting. "Nobody's stealing anything. We had a new survey done. Turns out the original property markers were placed incorrectly back in the 80s. This section has always belonged to my lot." She held out a folder like she was presenting me with a birthday card. Inside were fresh survey maps, legal paperwork, and a letter from an attorney I'd never heard of. Everything looked official. Professional stamps, signatures, county references, enough paperwork to make most people panic before asking questions. "You should probably read these," she said. "My lawyer suggested I hand them to you personally. It'll save everyone a lot of unnecessary drama." I looked past her toward what used to be my rose garden. Workers were already unloading stacks of stone for what looked like a retaining wall. A pallet marked luxury travertine sat beside a delivery truck, and farther back I could see steel framing for what was obviously going to become an outdoor kitchen. This wasn't a small landscaping project. She was building herself a resort. Vanessa had moved into the neighborhood about 3 years earlier after buying the biggest house on the block, one of those oversized places with fake stone columns, a circular driveway, and more exterior lighting than our local shopping center. She'd always been friendly enough if cameras were around or other neighbors were watching. But beneath that polished smile was someone who believed money could solve almost every inconvenience. Since her divorce the previous winter, she'd started renovating everything. New roof, new windows, imported palm trees that barely survived our winters, a massive pool, then a larger pool design because apparently the first one wasn't impressive enough. Every week, another contractor showed up. Every weekend, another catered party filled her backyard with music until midnight. People in the neighborhood joked that she was trying to win a contest nobody else knew existed. I never paid much attention because, honestly, what someone spends on their own property isn't my business. The problem starts when they decide your property belongs to them too. "You're telling me," I said slowly, "that after I lived here for 22 years, the property line magically moved 15 feet while I was asleep?" Vanessa smiled without blinking. "No, Daniel. The survey simply corrected an old mistake. Funny how the correction only benefits the person building an $80,000 backyard." Her smile tightened for just a second. "You can argue with my attorney if you'd like. We've already begun the process of establishing continuous use of this section based on irrigation, landscaping, and long-term maintenance. Honestly, I think you'll find it's easier to accept reality than fight it." Then she turned to the foreman. "Go ahead, guys. You're losing daylight." The excavator started again. I stood there listening to the engine roar while another section of earth disappeared beneath its tracks. Every instinct in my body wanted to scream, threaten lawsuits, call the sheriff, do something dramatic. But years of working as a maintenance supervisor had taught me one lesson that rarely failed. The loudest person in the argument usually knows the least. So I folded the papers, thanked the confused contractor for stopping long enough to talk, and quietly walked back to my garage. My old workbench sat exactly where it always had, covered with dusty boxes my wife used to call my museum of things I'll probably need someday. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for yet, only that something about Vanessa's story felt too neat, too convenient, too perfectly timed. And somewhere in the back of my mind, buried beneath decades of ordinary life, an old conversation with my late father kept trying to work its way back into my memory. One sentence I hadn't thought about in years, something he'd said while helping build this neighborhood before I ever bought this house. At that moment, I couldn't remember the words, but I had a feeling they were about to change everything. I spent the rest of that afternoon pulling dusty boxes off old shelves, opening faded file folders that hadn't seen daylight in decades, and wondering if I was chasing a memory that didn't even exist. My father had been an electrical foreman for a regional utility contractor back in the early 80s, and before he passed away, he saved almost everything: blueprints, inspection reports, handwritten notes, photographs, even coffee-stained maps folded so many times the edges had become soft as cloth. My wife used to tease him that if civilization ever collapsed, he'd probably be able to rebuild the entire county from his filing cabinet. At the time, it seemed ridiculous. That evening, it felt like the smartest habit anyone had ever developed. About an hour into digging through the boxes, I found a thick tube labeled Cedar Ridge Phase 1 utility plans. Cedar Ridge, our subdivision. My heart started beating a little faster. I rolled the drawings across the workbench and weighed the corners down with old paint cans. There it was, every water line, sewer connection, gas trench, and electrical route laid out in incredible detail. Then I saw the heavy red stripe running almost perfectly beneath the section Vanessa claimed belonged to her. Main electrical distribution easement, 20 feet wide. Permanent utility access. No permanent structures permitted. I stared at those words for a long time before reading them again, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Suddenly, my father's voice came back as clearly as if he were standing beside me. Never build over a utility easement, Danny. Doesn't matter who owns the land. The easement always comes first. I actually laughed out loud. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind that comes when two puzzle pieces finally lock together after you've spent hours trying to force the wrong picture. Vanessa had spent thousands on surveyors, lawyers, architects, and contractors, yet somehow nobody had bothered checking what was underneath the ground they were building on. The next morning, I walked the property before sunrise carrying the blueprint, a measuring tape, my phone, and a notebook. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for facts. Every measurement lined up almost perfectly. The retaining wall crossed directly over the easement. The foundation for the outdoor kitchen sat inside the restricted access zone. Even worse, workers had already poured concrete footings where utility crews would need to bring excavation equipment if the electrical line ever failed. Around 9 o'clock, my neighbor across the street, an older retired mail carrier named Frank, wandered over holding his coffee mug. "Looks like you've been busy," he said. I handed him the blueprint. His eyebrows slowly climbed higher the longer he looked. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "That's the main feeder." "Exactly. Does she know?" "I honestly don't think she does." Frank shook his head. "Or maybe she thinks rules don't apply if your lawyer charges enough per hour." That made both of us laugh, but only for a second. Because underneath the joke was a real problem. If those electrical lines were ever damaged, dozens of homes could lose power. Worse than that, someone could get hurt. By lunchtime, I'd photographed everything from every angle imaginable. Close-ups, wide shots, measurements showing exactly where each new structure sat, fresh excavation marks, equipment tracks, utility reference markers hidden in the grass that had somehow escaped the construction crew. I even found one old concrete survey monument almost completely buried beneath loose dirt. Somebody had nearly covered it with landscaping stone. Once I finished documenting everything, I called the regional utility company. After navigating what felt like 12 automated menus, I finally reached an engineering supervisor named Melissa. She listened quietly while I explained what I'd found. I expected skepticism. Instead, she interrupted me halfway through. "Did you say permanent structures over the primary distribution easement?" "That's right. Can you email me photographs and the location immediately?" Her tone had completely changed. Within 20 minutes, everything was in her inbox. Then I sent identical copies to the city's electrical inspector, the county planning office, and the Public Utilities Commission. I didn't exaggerate anything. I didn't accuse Vanessa of being malicious. I simply provided documentation and let the facts speak for themselves. Monday passed quietly. Tuesday morning, I was watering what remained of my backyard when I heard heavy diesel engines coming down the street. 3 utility trucks turned the corner, followed by 2 city inspection vehicles. They parked directly in front of Vanessa's house. Workers climbed out wearing high-visibility jackets while 2 inspectors carried clipboards and rolled up site maps. Vanessa stepped outside wearing expensive workout clothes and oversized sunglasses, smiling like she assumed everyone had arrived to admire her renovation. I could barely hear the conversation from my yard, but I caught enough pieces to understand the mood changed almost immediately. One inspector asked for permits. Another asked who approved construction inside the easement. Vanessa pointed toward her contractor, who looked just as confused as everyone else. Within minutes, the utility supervisor unfolded a large map across the hood of his truck. 3 employees began marking measurements with bright orange paint. Then one of them stopped, looked toward the excavation, and immediately called the others over. Something wasn't right. About 10 minutes later, Melissa, the same supervisor I'd spoken with on the phone, walked over to my fence. "Mr. Harper?" she asked. "That's me. Thank you for contacting us. You may have prevented a very serious incident. How bad is it?" She looked back toward the construction site before answering. "Their excavation appears to have damaged protective conduit surrounding the primary electrical feed. We won't know the full extent until we expose the line, but nobody should have been digging here in the first place." Right on cue, another worker waved his arms and shouted for everyone to stop. The entire site fell silent. Even from 50 yards away, I could tell something significant had happened. Melissa excused herself and hurried back across the yard. Half an hour later, bright red notices were taped to temporary fencing. Stop work order. Restricted utility access. Immediate safety review required. Vanessa marched toward the lead inspector, looking furious enough to melt asphalt. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "I have a licensed surveyor and a licensed attorney." The inspector didn't raise his voice. "Neither one has authority to eliminate a recorded utility easement. But the property belongs to me. Ownership and easement rights are 2 different things, ma'am. We'll fix whatever paperwork you think is missing." "This isn't paperwork." He pointed toward the ground beneath the unfinished patio. "This is infrastructure serving every home on this block." For the first time since this whole mess began, Vanessa looked genuinely uncertain. Not scared yet, just confused. She'd spent weeks believing every problem could be solved with another consultant or another check. Now she was discovering there are some things money doesn't erase. The following day, excavation crews returned, but not to continue building. They carefully removed sections of fresh concrete so utility technicians could inspect the buried conduit. By mid-afternoon, the preliminary findings became official. Construction equipment had fractured protective shielding around the electrical system. While the power lines themselves remained intact, the damage created enough long-term risk that repairs were mandatory before anyone could legally continue work. Then came the second report. Because permanent access had already been obstructed by retaining walls, plumbing trenches, and structural foundations, the entire expansion violated multiple utility protection requirements. Every major improvement planned for that luxury backyard now stood inside an area where it could never legally remain. I watched Vanessa sitting alone on her patio that evening long after the contractors had left. The music was gone. The delivery trucks were gone. Even the confidence she'd worn like expensive perfume seemed to have disappeared. For just a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I looked at the empty patch where Ellen's roses used to bloom, and whatever sympathy I had quietly slipped away. I still had no idea how expensive this mistake was about to become. But one thing was finally clear. The fight had shifted completely. This was no longer about 15 feet of backyard. It had become a battle between arrogance and the kind of laws that had been sitting underground for more than 40 years, patiently waiting for someone to ignore them. The official decision came about 6 weeks later, although by then everyone in the neighborhood already knew which way things were headed. Utility easements aren't suggestions, and they certainly aren't something a private survey or an expensive attorney can erase. Once the engineering reports were finalized, the city issued its order. Every permanent improvement built inside the protected corridor had to be removed. The retaining wall, the expanded pool deck, the outdoor kitchen, the custom spa, even portions of the new landscaping. All of it had to go. I happened to be trimming the hedge along my driveway the morning demolition crews showed up. It felt strangely familiar. Weeks earlier, I'd stood in almost the exact same spot watching machines destroy something I cared about. Only this time, they weren't crossing onto my property. They were tearing apart work that never should have existed in the first place. Vanessa walked outside just as the first section of stone decking was lifted into the air. She wasn't wearing designer sunglasses anymore. There was no coffee in her hand, no confident smile, no speech prepared by an attorney. She simply stood there with her arms folded, staring at a project she'd poured months of planning and a small fortune into. At one point, she noticed me across the fence. We looked at each other for several long seconds before she slowly walked over. "You knew," she said quietly. It wasn't really a question. I nodded. I remembered. She looked down at the ground between us. "You could have come talk to me." I took a slow breath before answering. "Vanessa, I did come talk to you. The morning your crew tore up my wife's rose garden. You handed me legal papers before I could finish my first sentence." She closed her eyes for a moment. There wasn't much either of us could add after that. Some conversations end because people reach an agreement. Others end because the truth finally catches up with everyone involved. Over the next month, the bills kept arriving. Demolition costs, engineering inspections, utility repairs, replacement of damaged conduit, site restoration, permit violations. None of it was covered by her insurance because the investigation concluded that the construction had taken place inside a recorded utility easement without the necessary approvals. Every appeal her attorneys filed reached the same conclusion. The easement had existed for decades. It had been properly recorded. It had never disappeared. No private property dispute could cancel public utility access. Eventually, the concrete was gone. The heavy equipment disappeared. And utility crews installed permanent boundary markers that stood waist-high along the protected corridor. They weren't attractive, but that wasn't their purpose. They were there to make sure nobody ever tried this again. A few weeks later, another truck pulled into my driveway, this one carrying fresh soil, mature rose bushes, and 2 landscapers hired by the utility company as part of the final restoration agreement. One of them asked if I had any preference for where the flowers should go. I smiled and pulled an old photograph from my wallet, one Ellen and I had taken almost 20 years earlier with those same roses blooming behind us. "Just like this," I said. They recreated the garden as closely as they could, and when they finished, I sat on the back porch until sunset looking at flowers that weren't exactly the originals, but somehow carried the same feeling. It reminded me that while you can't always recover what gets damaged, sometimes you can protect what mattered enough that it continues in a different form. As for Vanessa, she listed her house for sale less than a year later. Maybe the financial hit became too much. Maybe she simply wanted to leave behind a neighborhood where everyone knew the story. I honestly don't know, and these days I don't spend much time wondering. Holding on to anger is a lot like holding on to broken concrete. Eventually, it becomes heavier than the lesson it taught you. Looking back, people often ask if I felt like I'd won. The truth is, I don't think anybody really wins when neighbors end up in courtrooms and construction crews replace conversations. I'd have traded every legal victory for one respectful discussion before the first shovel ever touched the ground. But if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that confidence is never a substitute for facts, and money will never rewrite laws that were designed to protect everyone. Sometimes the most valuable thing you own isn't visible from the street. Sometimes it's an old blueprint tucked inside a dusty garage, a lesson your father mentioned decades ago, or a promise you quietly made to the person who planted roses beside you and trusted you'd take care of them long after they were gone. Those turned out to be worth far more than any luxury backyard ever could. If you've made it this far, I'd really like to hear what you think. Was I right to let the law take its course instead of warning Vanessa after I found the utility plans? Or should neighbors always get one more chance before facing the consequences of their own choices? Share your opinion in the comments because I'd genuinely like to know where you stand. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes property lines and respect should always go hand in hand.